You've never lived a real day in a working person's shoes, Miss Leavitt. OCC's voice cracked like a whip across the Senate Oversight Committee room. Cameras flashed. Reporters tensed. Karoline Leavitt sat motionless, her silver cross necklace catching the light, her signature red folder untouched before her. AOC pressed forward, mocking Karoline's youth, her polished appearance, her conservative values. He scoffed at Karoline's education, accused her of cosplaying as a patriot, and sneered, "You represent privilege in pearls, not people in pain." Gasps rippled through the room. Staffers exchanged uneasy glances. Still, Karoline said nothing. She didn't blink. She didn't flinch. Then, with deliberate calm, she leaned forward, opened her red folder, and locked eyes with AOC. "Congresswoman," she said coolly, "you asked for authenticity. Let's begin." The room fell dead silence. Even the cameras seemed to pause. What happened next changed everything. Like and comment below if you believe truth still matters. If you enjoy stories like this, let us know where you're watching from and subscribe to the channel, because tomorrow we have another inspiring story you won't want to miss. The gallery had barely settled before Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez burst through the chamber doors. She wasn't listed on the official docket, but she was here now, striding to the witness table with cameras swirling. A staffer whispered something to the chair. He nodded. AOC would be allowed to speak as a special expert on infrastructure and economic equity, but she didn't come to testify. She came to ambush. From the moment she sat down, the tone shifted. She didn't open with data. She opened with a dagger. Karoline Leavitt sits here in perfect hair and pearls, polished by donors and privilege. She's never known what it means to choose between rent and groceries. Her America starts at the country club gates and ends at the Capitol steps. A few in the gallery cheered. The camera zoomed in. AOC's voice rose. "This isn't about roads and bridges anymore. This is about who gets to speak for working families, and it's not her." She leaned in. "You call yourself a voice for the people, Miss Leavitt, but you were raised in a bubble of white Christian privilege. You didn't struggle. You inherited a podium." The accusation echoed. Karoline didn't flinch. She didn't speak. She took a quiet breath and continued writing on her yellow legal pad. AOC pressed harder, playing to the young progressive audience packed into the back rows. "You don't know poverty. You don't know sacrifice. You don't know us." Her voice cracked with emotion. Reporters leaned forward. Staffers on both sides stiffened. Still, Karoline didn't rise, didn't react. She just waited, and when the committee chair gestured to her, the temperature in the room shifted again. "Thank you, Congresswoman Ocasio-Cortez," Karoline began, her tone steady, almost gracious. "I appreciate your passion for working families. It's clear you care deeply about this country, and I respect that." AOC looked surprised, caught off guard by the absence of retaliation. But Karoline wasn't finished. "I'd like to briefly address your concerns about my background." She turned a page in her notes. "My mother worked night shifts as a trauma nurse. My father cleaned and repaired fishing boats on the New Hampshire seacoast. I attended public school. I took out loans to attend college. I worked part-time at a diner and cleaned offices in the evenings. I've lived the life you describe, just without the cameras." Silence gripped the room. Karoline looked directly at AOC Congresswoman. "Would you like to discuss your own record on working families?" she asked, calmly. "Because if we're going to talk about representation, integrity, and living what we preach, then let's put everything on the table." She reached down, her hands settling on the first red folder before her. She slid it forward and flipped it open to a tab labeled in sharp black lettering, Met Gala. The room froze. AOC's expression shifted. What the cameras never captured was the hesitation that followed. For a fraction of a second, Karoline didn't look at the folder at all. She looked at the ceiling, as if weighing something heavier than paper. The silence stretched longer than protocol allowed, and every person in the room felt it. Not tension, but anticipation. This wasn't supposed to be a confrontation, at least not officially. Behind closed doors earlier that morning, aides had warned Karoline to keep it clean, to keep it brief, to keep it safe. This hearing was meant to be procedural, symbolic even, something to satisfy critics without igniting headlines. Karoline had nodded, taken notes, agreed aloud. But agreement and obedience were not the same thing. When she finally lifted the photograph, her voice didn't sharpen. It softened. That was what unsettled people the most. AOC recognized the image instantly, not because of the moment it captured, but because of the feeling attached to it. The exhaustion, the pressure, the sense that she had to be everywhere, represent everything, carry everyone. The dress had felt like armor that night. On camera, it looked like celebration. Off camera, it had felt like obligation. No one in the room mentioned that part. Karoline didn't accuse. She narrated. She spoke about optics, not guilt, not wrongdoing. Optics. How symbols behave once released into the world. How intentions evaporate, leaving only interpretation behind. She spoke as though she were describing weather patterns, not people. AOC shifted, not defensively, but uncomfortably. Her mind drifted somewhere else entirely, to a hallway weeks earlier, to a staffer reminding her that declining the invitation would be interpreted as cowardice. That absence would be weaponized just as much as presence. That context never made it into the record. When Karoline referenced numbers, she didn't linger. She didn't dramatize them. She framed them as unresolved questions, not conclusions. Process issues, delays, administrative gray zones, the kind of details that never trend but quietly erode trust. The gallery reacted anyway, not because of what was said, but because of what wasn't denied. AOC considered responding. She opened her mouth once, then closed it. There was a calculation happening behind her eyes. Any explanation would sound like justification. Any justification would sound like distance. Karoline moved on before the moment could harden. That was deliberate. The letter came next, but not as an indictment. Karoline described it as correspondence. One voice among many, a human perspective, not evidence. She read it slowly, not to shame, but to anchor the room back to scale. AOC didn't look down because she felt guilty. She looked down because she recognized the tone. She had written letters like that once. Before staff filtered them, before cues formed, before urgency blurred into abstraction. The room listened differently now, not as a jury, as witnesses. Karoline closed the folder without ceremony. No flourish, no victory, just a pause. The kind that lets people fill silence with their own thoughts. And that was when everyone realized this wasn't about an event. It was about distance. Distance between message and moment. Distance between symbol and substance. Distance that grows quietly, invisibly, until one day it's impossible to cross. As Karoline reached for the next folder, a question lingered unspoken in the room. At what point does representation stop feeling like service and start feeling like performance? Asked calmly. Because if we're going to talk about representation, integrity, and living what we preach, then let's put everything on the table. She reached down, her hands settling on the first red folder before her. She slid it forward and flipped it open to a tab labeled in sharp black lettering, Met Gala. The room froze. AOC's expression shifted. What followed was not escalation. It was exposure to complexity. The second folder wasn't read by accident. Karoline had chosen the color deliberately. Red draws the eye. Red signals urgency. But urgency doesn't always mean wrongdoing. Sometimes it means contradiction. Campaign systems are complicated. Everyone in that room knew it. Layers upon layers of compliance, consultants, intermediaries. Karoline framed it that way, as a maze rather than a trap. She spoke about structures, not people, money paths, not motives. Yet as the diagram appeared on the screen, the atmosphere shifted again. Not outrage, confusion. The kind that makes supporters uneasy because it's harder to defend what you don't fully understand. AOC watched the flowchart like someone watching their own reflection distort in moving water. None of it looked the way it had felt while building momentum, while scaling fast, while trying to keep up with a movement that refused to slow down. Karoline didn't say wrong, she said opaque. That word landed harder than any accusation. She referenced messages not as proof, but as tone, casual language, overconfidence, the kind that develops when people assume momentum will outrun scrutiny. AOC felt a flash of anger then, not at Karoline, but at herself for trusting systems she hadn't interrogated deeply enough. Delegation had felt necessary. Oversight had felt optional until it wasn't. When personal connections were mentioned, Karoline didn't imply intent. She implied perception, how it looks, how it sounds, how easily faith turns to doubt when lines blur. The room reacted again, not loudly but internally. Staffers shifted. Reporters stopped typing and started listening. Then came the invoice, not framed as scandal, framed as misalignment. Karoline asked a question she never expected answered out loud. What does leadership owe its supporters when the line between mission and maintenance disappears? AOC's hands trembled slightly, not from fear, but from fatigue, from the realization that no speech could rewind optics already set in motion. Silence returned, heavier this time. Karoline didn't press further. She didn't need to. The room was doing the work for her now. When she closed the folder, there was no sense of triumph, only gravity, because the deeper message had landed. Movements grow faster than accountability, and when they do, intention is no longer enough. As Karoline reached for the next binder, the audience wasn't wondering what she would reveal. They were wondering something else entirely. How many systems survive on belief alone? Until belief runs out, asked calmly. Because if we're going to talk about representation, integrity, and living what we preach, then let's put everything on the table. She reached down, her hands settling on the first red folder before her. She slid it forward and flipped it open to a tab labeled in sharp black lettering, Met Gala. The room froze. AOC's expression shifted. By the time the final folders appeared, the hearing had transformed. It no longer felt like testimony. It felt like reflection. Karoline's tone changed, not sharper, but quieter, almost regretful, as if she understood that every example, every statistic, every contrast carried weight beyond the room. When she spoke about climate, she didn't challenge belief. She challenged consistency, the difference between advocating change and embodying it, especially under pressure, especially under scrutiny. AOC didn't argue. She listened. The numbers weren't framed as condemnation. They were framed as imbalance, scale versus expectation, visibility versus vulnerability. Karoline asked a question that hung in the air unanswered. How much sacrifice is symbolic, and how much must be personal before it feels real? No one moved. When district voices appeared, Karoline didn't introduce them as victims. She introduced them as reminders. People who had once felt seen and no longer did. That was the sharpest turn of all. Not anger, not betrayal, absence. AOC's expression didn't collapse. It hardened inward. The realization wasn't that she had failed intentionally, but that visibility had replaced proximity, that being everywhere had meant being nowhere in particular. The final folder wasn't about competence, it was about readiness. Karoline didn't mock. She contextualized. Pressure to lead faster than understanding allows. Platforms outpacing preparation, the danger of mistaking conviction for mastery. When the question came, it wasn't meant to embarrass. It was meant to pause the room, and it worked. The gavel ended the session, but not the moment. As Karoline walked away, she didn't celebrate. She didn't look back. Because this had never been about winning, it had been about contrast, between intention and impact, between voice and follow-through, between being heard and being present. Elsewhere in a quiet apartment, a woman folded a letter she never mailed. She didn't know what had happened in that room. She only knew she was still waiting. And that's where the story truly lingered. Not in the hearing, not in the headlines, but in the unanswered question left behind. When leaders speak for the people, how do we know they're still listening?